Welcome to the Capital Forum's 7th annual Antitrust Thought Leaders interview series, sponsored by KL Discovery. I am here today. I am Marta Tessagrossa, one of the Capital Forum's reporter in the Brussels bureau, and I'm joined by Barbara Rosenberg. Thank you, Barbara, for being here. Barbara is a partner in the antitrust team with Barbosa, Müssnich, and Aragão. So what I would really like to discuss with you today is the peculiarities and the perks of the CAGE review process. Ever since 2012, when CAGE became a suspensory jurisdiction, the importance of the Brazilian review has grown very quickly, and it would be very dangerous today for any notifying party to underestimate the value of this review. So if I were a client coming to you and asking, what are the peculiarities? Why is the CAGE review different from the American or European Commission's review?
Right. I think, as you correctly pointed out, Martha, I think that since 2012, it's hard to not to consider CAGE when you're doing a multi-jurisdictional filing. And in fact, given the type of fines and the type of reputation issues you can have if you do not file at CAGE or if you close around CAGE, companies have been more and more focused there. I would tend to say that the Brazilian process is more similar to the European one than to the US one. And just to kind of simplify, of course, there are specific twists.
Sure.
But the Brazilian filing has a form that is more similar to the Form CO, if I could say. So while in the United States you have a more simple HSR and some more limited information you have to provide, in Brazil the form is longer, and that's one of the points is important to point out because it can take some time for it to prepare. CAGE has two different forms in case the transaction qualifies for a long form, depending on the level of concentration, or you can have a short form if it's a fast-track procedure, and there are some specific rules which are pretty clear, I would say. I think CAGE worked well in terms of providing transparency and predictability, in terms of what qualifies for a long form and a short form. Of course, there are cases that could be on a gray zone, but generally speaking, I think it's fine to identify. And it can take, let's say, 2 to 3 weeks to prepare a short form, and it can take months to prepare a long form. So at the end of the day, something that it's important to have in mind. One difference between the Brazilian procedure and the European procedure, though, is that we do have a pre-filing phase for long-form cases.
Equivalent to pre-notification.
Which would be equivalent to pre-notification, but it's a shorter period of time. So during that period, basically, CAGE would review if the form is complete, and they would not really start any assessment on the merits. So normally the pre-filing lasts about a month. But I think that the key issue here is when we say we need to have, if you have a multi-jurisdictional case and you want to have it cleared in all different jurisdictions in due time, and we know that time is of the essence of any single transaction, and that's the first point that the client brings to us. It's important to be aware that it's not enough, let's say, to file at CAGE while you have been, when you're filing in Europe, for instance, because normally when you're filing in Europe, you've already engaged in many months of pre-notification, while that does not happen in Brazil. So it's important that you start as early as possible in Brazil as you are starting in other jurisdictions. And of course, I'm talking if you're talking about a long form case.
Of course, I can see that.
And maybe one thing that I would point out that is very particular to Brazil vis-a-vis other jurisdictions, because we see sometimes clients being surprised about that, is that the process in Brazil is particularly transparent. And so basically, whenever you file, your filing would become available the very same day after, the same week at least, when you're filing, and third parties would have general access. Of course, you can redact confidential information.
Of course.
But transparency is of the essence of the procedures at CAGE, generally speaking. And in that context, in fact, the parties have to be ready to know that third parties would know what are the arguments that are being brought, which is the type of argument that is being used, and so forth. And likewise, third parties challenging the case would end up being...
I was thinking exactly about that. So if a third party comes into a procedure and wants to complain or get a third party status in the proceeding, everything they're going to submit is going to go public, right? It's published on the
Pretty
website,
much.
if I'm
Yes.
not mistaken.
No, you're totally right. It's pretty much everything. Of course, again, confidential information that qualifies as such, and CAGI has also a clear guideline of what qualifies as confidential or not. And I'm basically talking about data about sales or clients, and I mean the normal data
Business,
that would be
yep,
treated as
business secrets.
business secrets. Other than that, the information would be all public. So that means that whatever discussion and battle and theories of harm and other things that would
Yeah.
be on the files would become more public. And again, I'm mentioning that because that's something that makes the Brazilian procedure a little bit different, or quite different, I would say, from
Quite
other
different.
jurisdictions, because you basically know everything that is being said, and also the papers would know, also
Exactly.
like commenting parties would know. So that's something that is, I think, is very peculiar. I think it has a historical reason. In Brazil, we do have, I mean, it's a civil law country with very strict due process rules, and there is this understanding that you should have the right to know what you're being, let's say, accused for, to make sure
Okay.
you can defend.
I
So
see.
that's a principle that goes higher than having the procedure confidential. Let me put it
I
this
see.
way.
I see why. Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting. I remember looking at a transaction that had been notified in Brazil and
Yes.
being absolutely shocked by the amount of
Yes,
information that were
exactly.
public, as long as you read Portuguese
Yes.
or are happy to use Google Translate.
That's right.
But it's really well done, and transparency is really of the essence there.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked about short track and long procedures.
Right.
What is the difference in timing in that space? You know,
That can be a really a big difference, I would
Okay.
say. And I think that there was a big concern at CAGI at some point in relation to CAGI when the law was approved, that CAGI could take too long to approve the cases, because historically CAGI has been quite slow in reviewing. Not
Okay.
CAGI, the whole system has been slow in the past. And I think CAGI has been doing pretty okay in terms of timing. Of course, you can have one thing or another that can go out, and of course, it can be the fault of the party or the fault of CAGI. I mean,
CAGI,
you
yeah.
might have different stories to say about it. But basically, if you qualify for a short form and you provide a complete filing, CAGI would take up to 30 days to review a complete short form filing. And then, as of the approval, you're going to have to wait additional 15 days to close the deal. That
Okay.
additional 15 days applies either both for the long form and for the short form. So at the end of the day, you're talking about 45 days. Sometimes CAGI can be quicker. We do not have in Brazil, as you have in the United States, an early termination procedure. So basically, whenever CAGI is ready, you don't have to wait a period of time. So whenever
Okay.
CAGI is ready to issue their opinion, they are going to issue their opinion. And CAGI needs to issue a written opinion with some, even if it's basic, some general information on why it's approving the case. It has to have a reasoning.
I see.
So,
I see.
And sometimes that also takes time. Not that on a short form case, it's not a big deal, but sometimes it happens that on a long form or a more complex case, even when CAGI calls you and said, look, I'm fine, it's just about writing the decision, it takes additional 10 days, 15 days.
Yeah.
And the parties get a bit anxious about that. And why is that they take long? Is because they need to write a decision.
Of
That's
course.
a requirement that we have in Brazil. So while the short form can take up to 30 days, and plus the 15 waiting period days, the long form cases, there is an informal deadline that CAGI uses. That is, when it's a long form case that does not require remedies, that meaning that the case doesn't need to go to the tribunal, it's revised only by the superintendents.
Yes.
In that case, CAGI tends to take up to 4 months. Some
Okay.
cases can take 75 or even 60 days and so, but whenever it qualifies for a long form, CAGI would generally take up to 4 months.
That's still a reasonable amount of time.
It seems to be. You might have an additional month of pre-filing.
Okay.
And I'm talking about long form, but not complex cases. That's an important point,
Okay.
that we are talking about cases that do not require remedies, which
Okay.
is an important issue in this context. If CAGI understands, if the superintendent, that is the agency that revises the case initially, understands that a remedy is needed, they're going to have to challenge the case to the tribunal, within CAGI's
Sure, of
tribunal.
course.
And in that case, then it's hard to say how long. I mean, CAGI would have up to 330 days. But to simplify what I
Okay.
said, you can have a 30-day review, up to 4 months review that can vary between normally 75 to 120 days, or If it's more than 120 days, it can take up to 330. CAGE has been generally clear in the case, even the more complex one, they tend to stick to the first term that is 240 days from the first filing.
So they really make an effort to be swift and efficient in their review.
Yeah, I would tend to say, Marta, that CAGE has been sensitive about that. What we always tell clients is very important that the parties really take into account that filing in Brazil at the same time is important. CAGE might feel uncomfortable or less pressured if you basically did a late filing in Brazil for whatever reason. But other than that, CAGE tends to try to stick with approvals in other jurisdictions.
So, yeah, that was the follow-up question I was going to say. What's the level of coordination between CAGE's review and CAGE's process and other jurisdictions?
Yeah.
Is CAGE really attentive to, is there a lot of collaboration between between the agencies?
Yes, there is a lot of collaboration. I mean, more and more whenever you have, of course, multi-jurisdictional filings, if you're talking about local deals, they could potentially exchange information about market review and other things. But whenever you have a multi-jurisdictional filing, CAGE asks for a waiver in a very, very early stage. They're going to ask you, where are you filing? And we would like to get a waiver to talk. I think there is special good communication with the United States and in Europe. That's what we see normally. And also among Latin American countries. And in some specific cases, you might have situations where they might be talking to other jurisdictions depending on where it's filed and the market and so on.
Okay.
And in that case, they talk about merits and they talk about procedure. And that could be important also to some extent coordinate remedies if that is the case. But we see more and more them talking. We see them sharing theories of harm that could be applicable in one jurisdiction or another. And precisely because of that, we push very hard to make sure we are consistent with the information provided across jurisdictions.
I see.
Because CAGE would ask for a copy of the Form CO or a copy of other filings you've done. And to the extent there is non-consistent information, CAGE would like to understand. Of course, you might have situations where the market could be global from a EU perspective and local from a Brazil perspective or the other way around. But you have to have a good story to tell, and you should try really to avoid having, if you're disclosing documents, the same documents need to be disclosed. If you're defining the market in one way or another, it's important that if it's not the same, and sometimes it's not, but you be as consistent as possible to make sure you have the credibility you need with the authority as well.
I see. Well, now we've talked about timing. We have talked about this last point. I wanted to ask you one more thing.
Yeah.
We have seen lately at least one case in which CAGE approval was the last one to come in. So the companies had obtained clearance everywhere and remained, until the last second unsure about how the CAGE review was going to go. That happens. We know that it can happen again. My question is, how would CAGE react if the companies in a similar scenario would ask for approval to close everywhere but carve out Brazil?
Okay, yeah, that's a very important and good question that normally comes the same time we get the question about timing, the second question is about carve-outs, and I think it's a very fair question, actually. And I think nowadays we have quite good clarity about that. With CAGE, as I said before, generally speaking, CAGE tends to cope with the timing and try to avoid being the last. It can happen for a number of reasons. The transaction can be more complex in Brazil, parties have filed later, or CAGE can have delayed the review for whatever reason. So, of course, that can happen. But the answer is that CAGE doesn't allow carve-outs. And nowadays, there is a very clear position from CAGE. They do have a decision that was taken a few years ago in which companies had a global deal. They basically got it approved elsewhere. For whatever reason, it got delayed in Brazil, and the parties carved out, and they closed elsewhere. And at the end, they were notified by CAGE. CAGE investigated, and the company decided to settle with CAGE, paying a substantial amount. And actually, CAGE said, well, it was half of the highest fine that could be applicable.
Okay.
But CAGE basically said it's half because it's kind of the first time we're sending a clear view, and you're deciding not to discuss this in court and not to appeal and so on. But I would tend to say that if this happens again, the fine tends to be higher. And in addition, carving out Brazil and closing around Brazil would be seen as a gun jumping situation. So the fines and sanctions applied to gun jumping would be the ones applicable. So besides the fine that can be up to 60 million reais, which is $50 million, a little bit more. Plus, you have the risk of the transaction being considered void. And CADE might also open an investigation against the parties. And if the parties are competitors, that could mean that they potentially could open a cartel investigation against the parties. We don't have such a situation because in the cases of opening, for instance, a cartel investigation, we don't have that because in all gun jumping cases that CADE revised, parties ended up settling with CADE. So as part of that, they paid some amount, and CADE did not open investigations as far as I'm aware. There was one case in which they decided to check which information was exchanged, more on the due diligence side and other things. But I think that's definitely something that parties have to have in mind, that gun jumping is an issue too, and they have to be careful and just taking the advantage that I'm speaking. And that's true, of course, not only in case of carve-out, but the gun jumping rules that would apply elsewhere would apply in Brazil as well. So that's important in terms of exchange of information between the parties, between signing and closing, and how they should behave. And so we do have gun jumping rules as well that apply in Brazil.
Well, that doesn't surprise me in a way. But thank you so much for being here with us, Barbara.
My pleasure.
It's really been a pleasure and a very interesting chat.